Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the War Report, and it is, as we're recording this, December 16th, 2020. By the time you see this, it will likely be December 17th, 2020. But we got a little bit of news for you, and we're going to start out with that the Electoral College has confirmed Joe Biden's totally legitimate election victory. Now, of course, we would never question the official narrative because we do not want to get banned from YouTube, and because we do believe that Joe Biden legitimately won because it's just so obvious. And if you question that, you are a conspiracist, and I will not tolerate that sort of rhetoric out there. But with that all being said, the Electoral College did vote to confirm Biden. It went generally along the quote unquote official election map that was played out. Now, there were cases of Republican electors or Republican delegations casting their votes for Trump, but it turns out it was pretty much a completely symbolic gesture to the point where Trump didn't garner any more votes for that. I don't think there were any really faith electors in this electoral college convention. Now, keep in mind, every state electoral college meets not like one body. Like every state has theirs, and then they report the results, and that's how the president is elected. And apparently, those results are confirmed by Congress on January 6th, which I think one thing this election has taught us all is how much just layers upon layers upon layers on the system that was supposed to be created as a restrained government to keep things simple, quote unquote, again, against like the complexity of the European monarchies, whatever. How many just like layers of complexity there are. And it makes me wonder, it's like, is that all just like a mythology that was imposed later on it? Or is that simple compared to how countries used to run? It makes you ask those sort of questions, but with that out of the way, it looks like, barring any crazy actions in Congress, which I don't foresee, that is confirmed Joe Biden will be the next president and will be inaugurated in about a month. So we can look forward to that for good or for ill. And we've speculated in the show where we think a Biden administration would go, and you hear more and more every day. And like I said, whereas I said last week, if you would have asked me, I would have given a 50-50 chance between legal challenges or whatever, and of course the Supreme Court didn't even hear the legal challenge. That was a 7-2 decision, with all of Trump's justices voting not to hear the case. So I guess loyalty doesn't really count for anything nowadays, but good thing we had the bastion of the courts, the conservative justices. They're just going to uphold. They're going to stop the loony left from taking over the country. Just believe me, and yeah, we'll see how that works. Even Amy Coney Barrett, or whatever her name is, who was just appointed weeks ago, like has been in there for less than a month, is deciding against Trump to the point where, look, I don't know, maybe they just don't want to rock the boat. I mean, granted, they're on the bench for life, so I doubt they really care that much. They technically don't owe Trump any loyalty, but it is a stark contrast between Democrats and Republicans how much more loyal Democratic appointed judges seem to be to Republican appointed judges. And you're already seeing one by one Trump's closest quote unquote allies abandoning him. I mean, Mitch McConnell, despite early on, was still pretty influential in Trump's administration. So he sort of, again, and that brings up um, all the rage for Mitch McConnell that these people had. The Moscow Mitch went to he's colluding with Russia too. I'm sure you all remember in 2017, 2018 when those things came up. But even McConnell has abandoned it and said, "Oh, it's time to move on. It's time to accept Joe Biden as the president elect and prepare for a legislative agenda to cooperate with the new Democratic president because again, it looks like the Senate is going to be held by the Republicans. Now, I know there's this runoff election in Georgia. We'll see how that turns out. That is for 2 seats, which, again, the Senate's mighty narrow right now, so that could be what flips it. And then there's all the debate among right wing circles. Do we support these Senate candidates? Do we not? Frankly, either way, I'm going to just say I don't have an opinion on this. If you live in Georgia, vote if you wish, vote for whoever you want to. I ain't going to tell you this because, honestly, looking at politics through purely electoral lens is important, but it's not the most important thing in the world, especially now, and especially after 4 years of Trump, two of which he had a completely Republican Congress behind him, all four of which he had a completely Republican Senate behind him, and we saw that turned out. So that should tell you pretty much all you need to know about electoral politics. But as I said, to summarize that, Joe Biden is, barring a major, major, major out of left field event, going to be the next president of the United States. And I imagine we'll probably see Trump start to concede that fact. I know he was making some noise about it and whatever. They still have a few tricks up their sleeve or whatever. But it seems like those things are winding down. The Biden transition teams, no pun intended, are probably going to start getting their meetings at the Pentagon. They already announced that Peter Buttigieg, or however you pronounce his name, Buttigieg, he's slated to be the ambassador to China if all goes well. So yeah, there's
Oh
that.
wow.
Uh, yeah, I expect you to get something in administration. I joke that he's going to be Secretary of State, but you want to hear a terrifying thought? Something I don't think they've announced this position yet, but I was thinking about this. So my prediction for both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, I said this person is going to be one or the other. She was neither. Imagine Susan Rice, head of CIA. That's my biggest fear right now.
Yeah, and one of the things that I sort of regret is that I didn't follow, enough of the stories about the particular instances of fraud and
Fraud that definitely didn't
about
happen, mind you, because we of
so it
course,
completely didn't happen.
yes, because we
Not one
respect
instance,
the terms of
not
service
one
of
instance
our
of
host
fraud,
platform.
not one. Uh, Very different than 2016 when Russia hacked the election. Trump really went out of his way to make sure that Russia would not hack the 2020 election. So, everybody saying we, uh, through the vote, got kicked out a dictator, he kind of helped you get there.
Yeah, yeah, you're welcome. And see, nobody's been
He's
tougher on Russia than Trump has. Okay, just let that sink in. Speaking of which,
yeah,
all the holdouts, such as Putin and Bolsonaro, after the Electoral College's decision, have officially congratulated Biden on his victory. It was Putin, Bolsonaro. I think Orban has just chosen to stay silent about the issue. But there was one other big one. I think. Oh, was it Xi Jinping? It was some other big one that was holding out that finally caved and said, "Congratulations to President-elect Biden."
I do respect them for holding out as long as they did. However regulatory that must have been, um, that is generally most of those countries only congratulate a new president or a president reelected once the electoral college has recognized that such person is now the president elect. But America's been in a special spot the last 4 years, and it's made a it's made a hysterical case for foreign government uh, electoral intervention and meddling. So I'm very sure that Biden's administration or administration to be would have preferred that all of those countries, you know, from Brazil to Hungary to Russia, would have recognized Biden, just as quickly as Boris Johnson did.
Or Benjamin Netanyahu, for that matter.
That's right.
Yeah, also, the other big news, Netanyahu also changed his Twitter banner photo away from him with Trump and just some like generic. I think it's just like some generic like Israeli flag in front of like the Israeli landscape or whatever. So yeah,
Yeah.
there's that, and of course Netanyahu's facing his own uphill battles, which we touched on last week. Again, as we said, it looks like Israel's probably going to yet another election, and and people have pointed out that the same forces that wanted Biden to win are also the same forces that aren't necessarily in the best terms with Netanyahu. So we could conceivably see a situation where there is a change of government in Israel. Now, I don't know that that would be the Likud party completely leaving power, or if it would be like the Likud party under a different leadership, because that's how those parliamentary systems work. A party can stay in power for 20 years and go through like five different leaders because of resignations being forced out, etc. But yeah, that's really what it looks like going forward. And we've given over the past, I don't know, what's been 6 weeks since the election, our general speculations on what to expect from a Biden presidency and what we think that would look like going forward. So I'm not going to touch too much on that for now, at least. We'll probably do that as Inauguration Day draws closer. But, I mean, like I said, I'm not really surprised. I also wouldn't have been surprised if there was some revolt in the Electoral College that it propelled Trump back into office. But that didn't pan out either. And, I do have to say, not that I have ever particularly disliked Trump, at least while he's been in office. We've of course had our frustrations with him, and ultimately I preferred him over Biden. But there is something almost I wouldn't even say satisfying, but there's a strange feeling you get about him leaving office. Like, this is what you get for your inaction. This is what you get for all the missed opportunities you had and all the things you have botched. Yeah, and that goes for everything from immigration to foreign policy, etc. And of course, like I said, it's not like I'm celebrating Trump leaving office, but there is it is almost like a "told you so" moment. Not only for us, but for Trump's, I would say, right wing detractors that, aside from the neoconservatives and the never Trumpers or whatever, but the people who always said Trump isn't living up to his 2016 promises. I do have to say there is a little bit of that feeling, and I'm not too particularly concerned about like the country going into a complete hellscape once Biden takes office. Now, I don't think things are going to be good. I think we're probably looking at another pretty extensive lockdown, which, in my personal state, fortunately enough, wouldn't affect me that much. But I know that for millions of people, including probably plenty of you in this audience, it would have a massive negative effect in your personal lives, in which I just generally am saying that you probably look forward to see these sort of things. The economy is probably going to slow down, if not fall into yet another recession. Now, how much that can be attributed to Biden, Trump, whatever, it just seems like that's the trajectory things have been going since about like 2019. You could say, of course, our economy is so broken it functions in these sort of cycles, but that's just how that's how the five-ish goes. Credit to any of you who get that reference. I kind of want to I kind of want to slap myself after doing that. And uh, but with that all out of the way, honestly, I'm not really feeling anything about a Biden presidency. It doesn't really evoke any emotions in me. Maybe it's because we've been with this show and with the internet in general so entrenched in all of this, none of this really phases me anymore. I don't believe in some of the more outlandish predictions that Kamala is going to send the black helicopters after you for right to fly gun laws or whatever. Now, I do think there will be a crackdown on, of course, internet activity, sort of like an increased rate of what we're seeing now with a lot of the tech platforms, and that's also been a big thing with the Section 230 and the budget bill trying to go through right now. But I don't believe most of the outlandish predictions, but I also see Biden making the situation worse in many ways, and that's really all I have to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think 2021 is going to be an economic year of reckoning far worse than 2008. Um, I think we're going to see a major economic decline, to be honest. It's not going to bode very well. I saw a TikTok video from New York with all these healthcare workers who, just based on the demographic alone and the hipster clothes that they were wearing, I'm very sure attended most of the BLM rallies, and especially in New York. And they're all dancing. There's a euphoria that what COVID has kind of provided for the ousting of Trump, as it were. Um, I think most of them realize that without COVID, Trump would have been reelected. There's no question. I don't think so. That there's any
Or
doubt of
insert
that.
equivalent crisis. That's as far as I'll go with that.
Yeah, yeah. So they're elated about that, right? You know, so we're supposed to believe that this incredible emergency and uh, hundreds of thousands of people have died, uh, absolutely related to COVID, caused by COVID, indeed. Of course, barring that you ignore what the CDC said, which is maybe 9,000, 9,500 directly related to COVID. Uh, anyhow, and all these things, it's important to understand what is the average death toll per month of all the years previous, and make a median based on that, and see how far 2020 deviates from it. Um, Once you subtract suicides and see if what they contribute, you can probably get a better understanding of the impact of COVID. That would also include people probably who did not get a chance to go to the hospital and so on. Um, in any case, I don't want to wander too far off. The elation that a lot of people who had Trump derangement syndrome is going to vanish. I, for one, will be full of glee when the economy really starts to tank, and these same people who quite literally in 2020 were saying it's better we have an economic crash than keep Trump. Which is sort of the parallel to um, I would sooner be friends with a pedophile than a Nazi, right? Of course, this is based on the definition of what they think is a Nazi.
Well, okay,
So
that's interesting, but that does beg another question. Would you rather be friends with an epophile or a Nosbol?
uh, so I mean that's what I think we can look forward to in
Okay,
the
just
year to
just to,
come.
just to clarify that last question, just to drag this joke on for way too long. That was just a libertarian check, just making sure there's no libertarians in the audience. I think you all passed. Hopefully, you all passed. I'll see when the time comes.
Yeah. Now this Friday, Trump is supposed to receive some kind of a report for dealing with Chinese infiltration related to the election. He's given a lot of people, like they're within the military and intelligence establishment, one last chance. I mean, it's really sad at this point. In a way, I mean, I think we can all intuit the way the American system runs. Um, and what I mean by this is, you'll hear reports about some, CIA blunder, or some Pentagon blunder, or so on. And honestly, I don't know how many of them are real blunders. I think part of the funds that these two institutions receive is literally to I don't mean they actually fake blunders, but to script events as blunders, or to narrate them as such. And I say this because we can always intuit, like we know, I mean, most of us who were old enough knew that America was going to bomb Iraq, and they knew there weren't any weapons of mass destruction. Everybody could intuit that without ever having to look at the evidence, without ever having to read an article. And in the same way, we could intuit that the Supreme Court was not going to stick up for Trump, right? He had his chances, he blew a lot of chances, but he also had a very narrow field to actually work with. Barr is sort of the latest example of somebody that is far more entrenched into the deep state. Basically, all that was the only material he had going. I mean, really, no one expected him to win. That's the reality of it, and that's why he could not and would not be allowed to have anybody, from his campaign. And I'm not trying to protect him or, um, you know, somehow suggest that he would have succeeded very much, or that maybe 50% of his promises in 2016 were BS anyways. Um, but Bannon being a clear example of a complete swindler, and even Trump basically receiving donations from average American, in many cases lower income Americans, for his legal fees. It's really quite something. But again, a lot of this is driven because of his mere presence, about which disturbs the entire American geopolitical struggle, right? Um, where America is going geopolitically has direct influence on its domestic policies, and the people who wanted Trump elected, were trying to right that course. And I think at the end of the day, one of the things that everybody had to balance was this idea of um, that there were political solutions. So people, really angry and disappointed with Trump, are even they're ironically some of the first to say that there are no political solutions, and yet they act by disavowing Trump so strongly, and feeling betrayed by him. That too is actually just an example of believing in political solutions. That's really what it is. That's why I never got involved with the all those arguments about, from the 5%. It's like, for me, they still sounded like people who believe that there was a maybe like a political solution to this, and there isn't. And I believe that Trump was not necessarily a political solution, but was the best form of destabilization necessary, right?
Yeah, that goes
The
back to the
problem is with
usefulness argument. The fact that, maybe Trump
yes,
was never anything more than Pat Buchanan light, at least in his campaign rhetoric. It was never bound to be anything more than a slight pushback to neoconservatism, to the empire, whatever you will. But at the end of the day, what he was in substance didn't matter. What he was in presentation and rhetoric meant everything in the world compared to that.
right, right, exactly. And there's a very interesting article. We can get into it later, but it ties in very well with what we're bringing up right now. And that is, there was a certain course that America was supposed to take. Um, Hillary Clinton, in many ways, was supposed to be almost like a capstone to that. Um, and I'm talking here particularly, about climate change, for instance, the Paris Accord, John Podesta's efforts meeting in China in 2014 to get that off the ground. Um, Look, we kind of scoff and joke about the idea of these American elites and all these other elites worldwide, globally, that are petrified of global warming. But for them, the way they look at it, global warming is going to have a very profound effect, both on Europe and on America. We've already seen the beginning of it in 2011, when it was a combination of a few things. Most articles won't mention drought. Will mention drought. However, they will not mention UN regulations for the pricing of crops went from like 120 to 200. It in some cases it doubled, and this is why you had in Cairo people protesting with baguettes. This is a region in the world where 40% of calorie intake is grain, it's bread. And so it had a profound effect, and a destabilization process, already started. And, we're seeing with Guatemala and Nicaragua as well. But, in a way, that's Obama's problem. He had Hillary Clinton as his chief of staff, and she's responsible for creating the problems in Nicaragua in the first place. So, global warming will mean very bad things, particularly, say, in America, where they're where let's say the increase in temperature will create more uninhabitable areas of the world. It will dry up certain farming sectors or rely more on water, which will that in itself exacerbate other problems. Americans are expected to lose 36% of like household GDP. Some areas, in the Middle East, like India, also could go down by 92%. China is projected to go down by nearly half. But there is a country that will benefit quite a bit. In fact, its GDP is set to quadruple just before 2100, and that's Russia. So even in small ways, the way that Trump avoided dealing with climate change issues, right? In their eyes, he is ostensibly a Russian asset, right? This last hurrah of a kind of quasi-American conservatism and pro-business and all of that, and in the end, Trump basically accomplished by giving corporations tax cuts, including those corporations you know, in uh, in Silicon Valley and Cupertino, tax breaks that have worked to undermine. So I mean, that's the irony and the tragedy of the whole thing.
Oh yes.
Um, so and we've discussed in the show before about how Russia is expanding its trade along the Arctic Ocean. 88 days is the longest anyone has ever seen in the so-called summer season, where Russia is able to transport goods uh, across the Arctic Ocean, and they're particularly worried about this, right? Um, Other things like the sanctions and the counter sanctions following Maidan in 2014. Everybody thought that Putin had shot himself in the foot when he decided to counter sanctions against the EU. But that forced the agricultural industry in Russia to kind of pull itself up by its bootstraps. There were some government initiatives as well. And so now Russia is actually exporting more grain than Kalashnikovs, and it's the largest exporter of wheat in the world. So, sorry to go on a tangent. I just I thought that article was very, very telling. There were some really great areas, and and politically, there's also destabilization that's going to be involved in all of this. In fact, the author, let me get you his name, Abraham Lustgarten. Um,
That's an interesting name.
yeah, this is for Pro Republica.
Mm, even more interesting. But you do bring up a good point, and I do think that, of course, on the right wing, especially in America, there is skepticism of climate change, global warming, etc. And I think I'm probably also speaking for you. I think you generally would agree with me when I say this. That look, it's not as severe as like what the doomsday scientists are saying, but yeah, something is happening. Human effects, again, that's an entire other thing, not really relevant to the topic at hand. But you, I think you've touched on a completely new angle. I don't think I've ever heard anyone else ever address this. That their primary concern about climate change and changing in weather patterns and Arctic sea routes and less polar ice, etc., is that it directly benefits Russia while directly harming the United States or the West as a whole, because several places in Europe, as you said, the Middle East, etc. Whereas Russia gets more arable farmland, you get the Arctic sea routes, which is why they seem to be so desperate to try to prevent any of this from happening, and how possible that is even, I'd say that's even up for debate. And of course, there's other things behind it, such as you look at the Paris Climate Accords. A lot of that is just a funnel of money from the developed Western world to a lot of what are ostensibly third world dictators who embezzle the money for them and their cronies. You know the story there. But I think that's a new angle on the climate change hysteria that, like I said, I don't think I've ever heard anyone touch on. And I think it's that last piece that also explains why they're so adamant about it, and that also goes back to a lot of the other issues they touch on, and that, which, whether that be the LGBTQ CIA rights, whether that be free trade, whether that be any of this, that it all boils down to their slipping grasp on power, that they're holding on by what seems to be the skin of their teeth. Now, again, that's not to take anything away from them. They seem to be pretty well entrenched, and they've honestly turned this whole coronavirus thing into something that looked pretty bleak for them into something that would just completely re-entrench their power. But moving on from that, speaking of elite powers, you want to get into the newest elite power struggle in the wake of the lame duck Trump presidency, the revived dispute between the Pentagon and the CIA.
Yeah.
You were telling me about this, so
Just,
I think I'll let you go ahead on this one.
yeah, just before I do, I just want to say, we often talk about destabilization, but one of the things we don't that is beginning to occur to me, is that destabilization is good as long as you're organized, but ultimately, although destabilization throws everyone off, who's ever the most organized is the one who's going to win. So I just want to leave that there. But yeah, so now the first time you heard of a deep row between the CIA and the Pentagon was just the first few months after the invasion of Iraq. There was an article in 2003, another one in 2005, and this was basically over, where the hell did the uranium go, right? And so you had all kinds of crazy articles that the uranium was shipped over into Iran, which is, convenient. But there was no intelligence, there was no proof that any of that had happened. And so that was the sort of the reason for the potential split then. We have, more uncertain reasons why there's a split happening now. But in another article that came out today that I found really fascinating was the Pentagon announcing that it would completely limit the vast majority of its cooperation with the CIA. Now, everybody knows that tactically, the CIA depends on the military, not just to blend in amongst the weeds, as it were. That is, CIA agents will go into a U.S. military base. America has thousands of them. But at the same time, they also receive details. These are military men who are asked to, work with the CIA. So they become sort of deputized CIA agents, right?
Yeah, so something that
And
was
they're
also,
there to,
just for the context, very popular in Vietnam. That
yeah,
was the Special
good point.
Operations Group. I don't know what they call them nowadays, but it's functionally the same thing. You see this all the time. My own personal theory says, our future ambassador to China, Pete Buttigieg, may have been one, or Pete Buttigieg, or however the hell you want to pronounce his name. I honestly,
Yeah,
it's been too long. I don't know. Mayor Pete, let's just call him. Yeah. But just for that way too long aside, I personally think he and plenty of other people, maybe someone like a Crenshaw, but a lot of these people just seem in like way in too deep for somebody who is like just in the military, even for somebody who's like a Navy SEAL like Crenshaw. I do I do speculate, just on a personal note, that those kind of people were part of this program.
right. That's a great point. So the DoD, the Department of Defense, under which the Pentagon exists, has stated that they want to reduce the amount of troop presence, and even CIA works within the Middle Eastern region. So, you probably heard something like 700 or 800 uh, U.S. military personnel are going to be leaving Somalia. We've already heard about Iraq, and we've heard the same about Afghanistan. But the DoD wants to reposition them with what it calls their near peers, and that includes China and Russia. So you can expect that the theater of conflict, as we were predicting, uh, even before the results of the 2020 election, that they would have to shift away from the Middle East. Um, and I guess in a sense, if they're good on this, uh, a conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Israel is probably more likely. Uh, a consolidation of further power by Iran is definite. Um, so I don't know what they're. I'm going to presume that they're going to focus on the South China Sea, and I'm going to presume that they're going to rearm Ukraine and try to disrupt Belarus in a more significant way than what we saw in the latter half of 2020. So, people have theorized some other reasons why this might be happening. Some have said because Trump has some, loyal men and women in the Pentagon who are frustrated with the CIA. A lot of this is, I don't know what to say about it. I mean, it could be true, but who is really loyal to Trump and who is going to remain loyal to Trump?
Q's
Um,
loyal.
Q is loyal. Um, what I guess what I'm getting at is, in a sense, um, Trump will go down as a bad optics president, and as his days wind down in the White House, a lot of these institutional figures in the military and intelligence that may have been genuinely on his side are going to betray him. It really will be back to business. It really will be like we'll go back to 2016, essentially, but worse.
I'd say even to the darker times, something like 2013 or 2014, and it does. I can't help but be reminded of the story where there's I think it's a general testifying in front of a congressional committee saying that of all the forces we trained to fight ISIS, how many of them were successful? Out of the 5,000 trained, how many of them were successful? And he simply just says five. And he talks about
Yes.
how a lot of these groups defected, and it was revealed in all of this that the groups the Pentagon were training ended up fighting the groups the CIA was training instead of fighting against ISIS or fighting, I suppose, they wouldn't outright admit this, or fighting against Assad's forces, as it were. But it goes back to this rivalry that's existed for a long time between the Pentagon and the military. And just for a brief, oversimplified history, intelligence agencies in the United States prior to World War II were simply a wartime affair. They were put together during the beginning of war, and like right before war, at the beginning of war, during war, and they were dismantled shortly after the war. World War II was the exception for obvious reasons, as we were propelled in the status of superpower. The OSS, which was the intelligence agency makeshiftly put together by the military for World War II, evolved into the CIA. Very dark and sinister stuff in that transformation. So there's always been sort of, I don't know what you call it, a resentment of the military that the intelligence agencies got to be independent from them and not just another branch of them, that they operate as we saw them break away. So there's always been a rivalry since the late 1940s between the two. Vietnam is another great example for this. I suppose you could also contribute sort of the American lack of success, despite many reasons. I think you could probably say that a main reason was the rivalry between the CIA and military and the different ideas and different plans they had. And I think this is a common theme throughout the Cold War, the butting of heads of the two. And I suppose that all culminated with something like Syria, something like the Arab Spring, where they have conflicting interests, and because the American government is such a free for all, and there's no real central figure who, I mean, theoretically there's, but in practice, there's no real central figure who can come in and crack the whip and say, look, I'm in charge of both of you. Theoretically, this would be the president, but we all know how that works out. And you're going to do what I say, and you're going to cooperate whether you like it or not. Now, I'm not saying other countries with stronger executives don't have problems with inter-service rivalry, but much less in the United States because the United States just seems like such a I don't even know the word for it. It just seems just so open to these sort of abuses for whatever reason. And I have my speculations on that, but I won't get into that for now. So I do think a lot of people will look at this, look at the CIA and military rivalry coming re-emerging, and think, "Oh, this is another sign of the late stage empire." And I'm not saying it necessarily isn't. I'm not saying that this doesn't show we're in dire straits as an empire, so to speak. But it's also nothing new. Even at the height of American power and stability, this rivalry existed. But I do think this rivalry will be much worse in the backdrop of everything else going on. And that it's going to do a lot more, and it's going to just drive this system, this empire, into the ground a lot faster than it even would on a regular trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of fascinating how America is like a legit global empire instead of a continental empire. Coincides with World War II, and when intelligence agencies become a permanent fixture of governmental institutions, because it's at that point that America, like, literally has to be at war continuously, and that is the reason why that there's all these intelligence agencies like the CIA. Uh, the military reflects kind of an older attitude, very much uh, in the sense of Europe as it was before World War II, even Europe before World War One. So the Perma War kind of created the necessity of intelligence agencies, and a lot of it, I think that a lot of the disagreements are based upon like a different concept of what each agency thinks America is or what its role is, right? And definitely the CIA reflects the idea of America as an empire, but an empire that's ascended to the keeper of a kind of how can I put it, like the keeper of a kind of financial empire that is intermeshed with the American empire. And I think that the Pentagon, especially considering its choices about who to back in Syria, reflects something of the older approach. Um, Still a global power, still an empire to a great degree, but that ascending to just being only a protector of financial capital, global financial capital, is something that doesn't sit well with them. And you know, like I'm cutting a fine line here, right? There isn't that much of a difference, but there is. Like for somebody on the outside, it could be judged as being only 3 or 4 years of acceleration towards good or bad relations with America, so to speak.
I think that's a
If that makes sense.
yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to put it. But with that being said, speaking of the unfurling of the empire, there is probably one of the more interesting stories, something we've speculated on for a while, and that is the Turkish question. Now, the
Oh
European
yeah.
Union has imposed sanctions on Turkey, and the United States is expected to do the same relatively soon. Now, of course, this was over the S 400s, this is over those things. They didn't outright say it was over the situation in the Caucasus. They didn't outright say it was over Libya or any of these other things. It was the main cost of this was their trading of military equipment with Russia, them buying the S-400s. The United States was not pleased, of course, about the S-400s. They made that clear again more recently, but they haven't moved to put any sanctions on Turkey yet. And people are speculating, as one of the outgoing acts of the Trump administration, is that he plans on joining in the anti-Turkey sanctions, which we've talked about this sort of situation for quite some time now. Maybe in the more drastic sense of an expulsion from NATO, which I don't think is in the cards yet, but with how rapidly things change, with how just generally unstable things are, I wouldn't be surprised if there's significant calls for that going forward into the next few years. But we're seeing yet again a contradiction in policy, and I'm really curious to see how the Biden administration addresses this because if you're operating under the model that Russia is the primary threat that must be countered at all cost, isolating Turkey is far from the way to do it. But it also plays into it if you want to support the Kurds, which again also benefits Israel to an extent, which benefits the American empire, which has all these other benefits. If you want to support the Kurdish groups at the expense of Turkey, or support the Eastern Mediterranean states at the expense of Turkey, again, sort of which horse do you want to bet on? I suppose to paraphrase very loosely, Lord Salisbury, and I think that was, I
Mm.
think that was early 1900s. I think that was, yeah, I think that was actually right after World War One. I could be wrong on that, but that's minor details, and I don't see, barring Erdogan getting overthrown, and even then with the just general change in political culture in Turkey and the direction it seems to be going on its own, I don't see some sort of great reconciliation between Turkey and the West that really sets things right. And I think that sanctions against something very mild is yet a first step we're seeing in a divorce between Turkey and the West. Now, how long this will take beats me. It's probably going to be decades. I doubt it's going to be something that happens overnight or even in the 2020s for that matter. And that puts Turkey in a precarious situation because they're being isolated from the West. The West is growing angrier and angrier with them by the day. They aren't necessarily in the best terms with Russia, even though this entire dispute is allegedly over them buying Russian military equipment. They're reasserting their foothold in the Middle East. They're making rivals in particularly Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Their relationship with Iran is anyone's guess. Their relationship with China isn't bad, but also isn't good. And it looks like they're really trying to establish themselves in, from probably a very ambitious point of view, really trying to establish themselves as yet another power block of pretty much a new Ottoman Empire, if you will. Now, I know that term gets thrown around a lot. A lot of people like to use that, but it generally does look like this is the direction they're going. Turkey has always been able to punch above its weight, and especially in recent years, even as the Ottoman Empire was able to punch above its weight, just because of its vital geography and just where it's situated and the sort of manpower it has. But it looks like they're really taking this, having no loyalties to either side or multiple sides of this burgeoning Cold War, this new global chessboard, if you will, if you can even call it a new Cold War, because I mean, it's more than just two powers now. We're seeing multiple, again, quite literally multipolarity. It looks like Turkey wants to be one of those poles, even if a minor one. And again, they seem to be successful so far, but I'm really curious to see, especially how a Biden administration, especially how the European Union, Macron in particular, we all know that France and Turkey have become, I would say, at this point, complete rivals. I don't think there's very little I would say their interests align on. So again, I think when it comes to the fate of the European Union, the fate of NATO, these post-war institutions that have existed again more or less since 1945, hinges on what Turkey does. In a sense, you could say Erdogan is currently the most powerful man in the world. Now, by the metrics they usually do, it's always somebody like the president of the U.S., president of China, president of Russia. And again, I know the past few years oscillated between Putin, Trump, and Xi Jinping, but I would say from a practical standpoint, looking at everything going on now, there's generally a good case to be made that Erdogan is the most powerful person in the world. He's definitely the most powerful person in the Muslim world, most powerful person in the Middle East, I would say. But I would take that a step even further because so much of what Turkey does will dictate the course of global politics just by who they choose to align with or if they choose to be unaligned from any global powers. And what Erdogan or whoever may succeed him is going to do in these next few years over the 2020s and 2030s, etc., is going to be probably some of the most important decisions we see of this century.
Yeah, I think Turkey gave a speech, a kind of victory speech in Azerbaijan, claiming that Turkey and Azerbaijan are really just one country. It's really quite amazing, and I'm very sure Azerbaijanis are will be quick to embrace that. Um, at least the vast majority of them. I I understand that Turkey, or I mean, particularly Erdogan, has an idea of where Turkey needs to be, and that being just an important part of NATO and American geopolitical strategy isn't really in line with the kind of ambitions he has for his country long term. Um, but I think he also is betting on potential new conflicts where he could be realigned and asked upon for his services in the next 10 years. Like, take for instance, America now will, like, let's suppose the Biden administration will mean uh, less involvement in South Central Asia and the Middle East, and the Horn of Africa, that whole region. It's a big block, I understand, but those countries are very much interwoven as well. And America's presence has been there, like, really for a very long time, and most definitely after its rise as the global superpower post World War II. So I think what it's betting on is, as America shifts its sights elsewhere, it sees that the Middle East will be more open for its uh, advantageous position. In other words, let's say a conflict might erupt between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and America isn't there in the same capacity to monitor those situations. Turkey stands to gain depending on which side it chooses to support. Let's say it involves Israel. Absolutely, there will be a conflict, where its positioning with Israel in a positive manner could mean dividends, let's say, with oil refineries in the Eastern Mediterranean. Um, there's many other examples. Let's say that conflict in Ukraine goes really hot, and Ukraine really needs Turkey to step up pressure against Russia, and America would like that too. So Turkey's very much taking advantage of the kind of vacuum that is being created by America departing out of the Middle East. And I mean, it sees that it can commit these transgressions against America and NATO because it knows that America and NATO will still need it.
Yeah, and again, I think that's the entire basis of Turkish actions over the 2010s into the 2020s. That fact that Turkey, the West needs Turkey more than Turkey needs the West, and I do think that is generally agreed upon by everyone. And with how much they're allowed to get away with the sort of things they're allowed to get away with, I don't think there's any disputes at all. And there will be eventually be some flare up in the Middle East, in the Caucasus, wherever, where Turkey will gladly re-embrace the warm arms of NATO and the European Union and will gladly take the same side with them in that conflict. And again, the West, in its attempts to maintain the same sort of hegemony that they've held for the last, I don't know, let's just be generous, say 75 years since the end of World War II, that sort of American led system will acquiesce to most, if not all, Turkish demands in that case because they know just as easily Turkey could just as easily side with the other side in these sort of conflicts, especially with something in the Caucasus or something in especially the Middle East. You think Syria, Iraq, whatever. Maybe it's a new tensions with Iran that's bound to be the sort of set off with this, where Turkey can make or break whatever side they choose to align themselves with. Because again, in a potential conflict with Iran, or not even conflict, but any potential action sort of against Iran, Turkey's been wishy-washy. Sometimes they support it, sometimes they don't. With the Soleimani strikes, they were surprisingly quiet. Yet they're up
Hmm.
there with Erdogan's always up there with Rouhani and Putin at those Caspian Sea summits. So it's just all over the place in regards of that. And with the Syria summer, it was back in 2018, 2019, where Putin, Erdogan, and Rouhani were meeting on what, like every 3 weeks or so, maybe sooner, maybe more than that. But you had all of that happen, and really, I don't know much more to say about this than Turkey is the place, no matter what. Like barring maybe East Asia stuff, Turkey is the place you want to look if you want to know what is going on in the world and you want to know the direction that global politics will take. And with that being said, we have a little bit of news out of the Caucasus. So over the weekend, Armenia and Armenian militias and Azeri forces clashed again. Now those clashes have since been brought to a halt as of Monday, December 14th, but it was mainly on the issue that the Azeri forces were not pleased that there were remaining Armenian militias and Armenian paramilitary groups in Nagorno Karabakh. And of course, this flared up. They skirmished. It was brought to a general peace. And one of the more surprising developments out of this is that I want to get the exact wording on this right because it was very particular. But let me see. I sent that to you, and the Nagorno Karabakh government said that Russia will begin the process of granting Russian citizenships to Karabakh residents in the next
Hmm.
week or two. Now, rumor has
That's
it
incredible.
that the rumors are already going around, but it's officially being said now. Now, that's all they went for with this. Now, this could just be something they're saying and not following through on, but it does show with this sort of patchwork peace deal that was made that really gave an upper hand to Russia in terms of patrolling the region and having a foothold in the region, that they're committed to that. Because if they were to seriously go through the process of making these people Russian citizens, any Azeri or any Turkish backed forces that would attack them would be ostensibly attacking Russian citizens, which is not territory they want to wade into, especially Azerbaijan, which is much closer economically and politically with Russia than Turkey. It's not saying that Turkey doesn't have any interest in keeping good relations with Russia, but Azerbaijan much more so than Turkey. And that would add just yet another, uh, I would say, string in a web of the complex Turkish-Russian relations that we've seen in Libya, that we've seen in Syria, that we've seen, hell, even in Ukraine of all places. And then add the Caucasus, especially if these people are considered Russian citizens living in the Caucasus. Now, I'm, I don't,
It's incredibly ironic, isn't it?
yeah,
Like that that there was a color revolution in 2018, rumblings of it, almost succeeding in 2016, and by 2020, like Russia now has new bases in the Southern Caucasus, that offer an amazing vantage point. Both were monitoring Turkey, but also Armenia, and Ascent is just as good as them having that piece of Georgia with the Ossetians, right? It's really an amazing flip that's happened. Um, I mean, I'm going to presume this is mostly Putin. I don't know, but if it is, like, this is just it's brilliant, frankly. Like, even the whole counter, I still marvel over them counter sanctioning Europe with their agricultural products and then like rising to like outselling even America in wheat production. It's just he's done a lot of counterintuitive things that have worked out, and maybe that's why he probably has such a strong inner circle, because he does seem to come through.
And I honestly don't know what the conditions of it. Now, again, they would be Russian citizens. Now, whether that would give them the right to go to Russia proper, which there is a significant Armenian population in Russia as it is, or whether they just be considered under Russian protection. That's again, I didn't see the exact details of it, and granted, they're kind of skimping on the details. They really didn't tell you much about it, probably intentionally, but this is similar to what they did in Ukraine, where they offered to fast track Russian citizenship to Ukrainians moving into Russia. So, again, this isn't something we haven't seen before, but
Hmm.
I don't know. It would just add yet another layer of sort of Russian involvement into it in a region it seems like they've really reasserted themselves in with this peace treaty about a month ago, to the point where it looks like they are in for the long haul in the Caucasus. This just wasn't some patchwork peace agreement. They have long term goals in terms of reasserting their foothold in a place that they ruled centuries prior, but of course lost control very recently. And I guess that, as you were saying, the irony of it, the color revolution trying to drive Russia out of its own backyard, out of its former empire, out of the former Soviet Union, etc. It looks like, yeah, there's been degrees of success with that in Eastern Europe, especially in places like Ukraine and, of course, the other Eastern European states, the former Warsaw Pact states such as Poland, Czech Republic, Romania, etc. But it looks like between Belarus and this model doesn't really seem to be working out anymore. This color revolution model they've employed has actually completely backfired, and even arguably in Ukraine it backfired with the ascension of
Yeah.
Crimea into Russia, with the fractured state of Ukraine currently. But it's it's definitely going to be something to watch going forward. And again, if these people actually do end up becoming like full Russian citizens, like I said, it's probably going to either a bring peace to the region pretty fast, or another thing you also have to consider is plausibly deniable terrorist attacks where some ethnic Azeri or some whatever commits an attack against a military outpost or civilian target in Nagorno Karabakh, and the Azeris and the Turks or whatever group adamantly deny that they had anything to do with it, while again sort of fighting the proxy war things. Well, they may be supporting these organizations materially or with intelligence or whatever way they may be supporting them, but in a plausibly deniable enough way to where you can't really pursue it further and counterattack, so to speak. So it could make the situation better, or it could make it worse in that sense. I think time will tell. I think generally, if this does go through, it will buy at least the region some peace it probably hasn't enjoyed in about 40 years.
Hmm. Yeah, and now it becomes ever more difficult, to dare to attack that region again, because you're ostensibly now no longer attacking Georgia, you're attacking Russia. And I mean, it is one of the things I will admit that the West was deeply afraid of happening back in 2014, and as I mentioned earlier, that only became more exacerbated once Trump was elected. But yet here we are. It is in its own small way happening.
But with that being said, I think we should move on to Belarus, where it's not really a major story, but again, the Tinovskaya grift continues, and of course, as I mentioned, Tinovskaya is the winner of the EU's Sakharov Prize for Freedom, and of course, during her acceptance speech for this wonderful prize, she urged the European Union to be braver in standing in solidarity with the Belarusian people as they fight against the evil authoritarian dictatorship of Lukashenko, or however we're calling him. And again, just the grift continues. I can tell you, she's look. I think the ultimate fate of this, barring some crisis in Belarus that actually does lead to the toppling of Lukashenko, and even then, I don't think if Lukashenko was toppled or actually does leave office at the beginning of next year, whatever, I still don't think she should have a snowball's chance in hell in holding any significant political power in that country. But her fate going forward, just looking at it, is she's going to live somewhere like Lithuania or maybe somewhere in the West and be a talking head for whatever news media outlet picks her up. Or again, it's going to be one of those sort of things where just a very vocal, especially in this case, nagging sort of voice talking about the oppression of Russia and Belarus and how Putler's actually behind this all, and we have to embrace trans rights and hypercapitalism, or else Russia wins. And it's just going to be one of these voices. I joked the other day that it's going to be her, Navalny, and Guaido. They're all going to be up there at the
Yeah,
DNC talking about talking about trans rights in their respective countries and how this is the human rights issue of our era. This is like fighting the next new wave of fascism. And again, I would have figured she would have tapered off by now. Guaido, you still occasionally hear about him, but he tapered off by this point back in his heyday. Nobody cares about him anymore. Navalny, he's had incredible staying power, but it looks like he's finally starting to taper off again. He wanes and waxes as it were, but I don't know. With somebody as unimpressive as this, especially considering the fact she's the voice of her jailed husband, I've I didn't figure that this grift would that last that long. Now, of course, she would try it, but I didn't figure she'd still be getting this much attention. It's been it's been what 4 months since this all broke out. 3 4 months. I don't know.
yeah,
Was that? Yeah,
August.
it was in August. It was in August. I think we're actually. I think it was actually August 16th, which means it's like been like 4 months exactly when these protests really took the full force. And look, it looks like the girl boss revolution has failed, and I guess people decided that they want a incompetent old potato farmer over a corporate lesbian. You know what? Frankly, I don't blame them. I would take the kindly old potato farmer, no matter how incompetent he is, to run my nation any day over some lady who looks like she got lost, on her way to the HR department. But whatever, whatever.
Yeah, it's a. I guess the whole trans kids definition and I don't know, gay adoption definition as the ultimate expression of freedom and inclusivity uh, is very much the same way the CIA funded abstract expressionism in the 50s, right? The whole point actually is for the U.S. to and the and the U sorry and the West is along with the U.S. is to create as much of a dichotomy, as much of a difference as possible, right? So you can never mistake Russia from America or from what America and American world power represents. Uh, that's so people understand, friend enemy distinctions, right? So it's gay, but it's also very Schmittian. Uh, but the thing is that a lot of people within the West right now are tired of it. Uh, the geopolitical efforts to establish this uh, let's say this cultural progression uh, is actually beginning to backfire. I mean, that is one of the reasons why Trump was elected. Uh, is because frankly people are sick of it and are demoralized by it in a way that funding the CIA, funding abstract expressionism could never do. Vastly different, and not just that, but a vastly different time. Um, I guess they're betting on it. I guess one more Guaido, one more Kasparov, one more Navalny. I suppose they want, a kind of expat star-studded cast, where the more they have, right, the more they can wear down. But it's an old Cold War tactic, and no matter, I mean, the efforts for which America will have to go in order to distinguish itself from Russia are immense in comparison, let's say, with the Soviet Union. Um, the Soviet Union was never something what the West and America ever looked like. For a lot of people, when they look at Russia, Russia is simply like what America was like about 30 years ago, right? So I don't see I could be wrong, but I don't see at this point how this effort is going to be successful.
It honestly can only be described as flailing. And, with that, before we deviate into our closing news about Syria, I think what can also be described as flailing is the West response to their loss in Hong Kong. Now,
Yeah,
the UK has taken this to its most logical extreme, where they have granted just protection. I don't know if it's outright citizenship, but pretty much the right to residency in the UK to 3 million Hong Kongers. Now, the concern about this, and I think it's a very real concern, that they want to take in these poor Hong Kong refugees who just love freedom in the Anglosphere, but probably ignoring the fact that the Chinese government has probably laced all of these quote unquote refugees with spies. Or we could see,
yeah,
even assuming that it doesn't go like that, we see this with the Taiwanese all the time, where the Taiwanese who emigrated from Taiwan in the 60s and 70s, in the then, their children and grandchildren, I mean, like people like Ted Lieu, they're completely fine with the incestuous relationship the West, particularly the United States, has with China. And you see this out of a lot of Taiwanese in California, where at home in Taiwan, they're starting to view themselves as distinct people from the Chinese, which is rather ironic considering the fact Taiwan was set up as a Chinese government in exile by, Chiang Kai-shek, which, he must be rolling over in his grave just, all sorts of ways right now, looking at the modern state of Taiwan. But that's aside the point. And you have that, and you could very easily just have that case with the Hong Kongers as well, which I do think you would. And in the United States, there has been a bill introduced in the Senate. I believe it's actually passed the Senate, still waiting on House approval and, of course, presidential approval, that would grant temporary protective status to Hong Kongers. Now, we did that for El Salvadorians and other Central Americans after a series of natural disasters in the early 2000s. And plenty of those people are still here today. In fact, that's actually the basis of MS-13. A lot of those people we took in got into crime, formed gangs, and we had that. Now, I doubt the Hong Kongers would be forming gangs. I doubt the triads would make a massive resurgence. But what they would do, is these people, especially the type of Hong Kongers who pretty much spearheaded the protests, and you had that. What they boiled down to is, frankly, the sort of people who you would find in places like Seattle, places like Portland, places like California, places like New York. Again, they are very much like the coastal elite. These people are, for whatever reason, born and bred middle management people. These are the annoying HR people. These are your annoying liberal bosses. And while they may stand there proud flying the American flag and the Union Jack at their protests in Hong Kong, these are the same people who would scoff at Pennsylvania steelworkers and Kentucky coal miners and working class people from the north of England if they actually lived in those countries. So again, it's all tactical. They feign this love for America for the UK, whereas really, they'd fit in just fine with the elites of both those countries and the middle management classes of both those countries. But when it comes down to the
Hmm.
salt of the earth, the people who actually make up those countries, those cultures, they would have nothing but contempt for them. The same way, like I said, somebody from Seattle or Portland would. And of
That's an
course,
excellent point.
of course, we talk a lot on the right, a lot about the issues of low skilled immigration. A lot of people coming in from Latin America and doing jobs that are generally manual labor, etc., and driving down the wages of those jobs and the workers' protection for those jobs. But also, there's been more increased talk about this with the H-1Bs and everything like that. We would be importing high skill laborers, which would already make the nearly useless college degree even more useless than it is now by these people. And again, it'd be like importing a foreign middle management class, which is arguably worse than a foreign ruling class because these are the people on the ground. These are the pencil pushers who really run society for better and for worse. And these are the kind of people we'd be handing it over to if this were to hypothetically play out. Now, of course, it wouldn't be a massive takeover. A few million Hong Kongers wouldn't do this, but yeah, in places like Portland, places like Seattle, and a lot of these coastal cities that are already very liberalized, they probably would work their way up and become like the ruling elites of these cities, similar to how we've seen how much Indians in the United States, Indians from India, that is, have become prominent in the business classes, or the way you could say going back a few centuries, the way Jewish groups, the way the Irish took over political machines in the Northeast, and
Hmm.
you've seen this play out time and time again with these groups that come in and really become a ruling class in and of themselves, even just on local levels.
Right, and you don't necessarily need 3 million in order to achieve it, and yet 3 million is considerable. Uh, Many of them already have ties with Britain to begin with. Uh, no less so, in with banking and finance. So, but I mean, it's the price to pay. We saw the protests, and most of the people could guess that as the protests went on, the demands of the protesters kept increasing, and they
Kept increasing
shifted
and became more vague. That that
more.
that
Yes,
that
more
glorious
vague.
combination.
Right. So, in other words, what that revealed about them was that it really wasn't. It was about autonomy, like actually total autonomy, actually being brought back into the fold of the West. And if it couldn't be Great Britain, then it ought to be America. That's ultimately what it was about, and they failed at it. Uh, Also, Hong Kong is another. It's an interesting nexus because it had all these gay attributes about it. I mean Ghey. So you had
Gay
these
isn't
thoughts.
happy. Okay, look,
Yeah.
we're a bit old timey on this program.
So you had everything from like cam girls protesting, like Chinese. These are Chinese Hong Kong cam girls protesting for freedom. Young men dressed up as Harry Potter, like holding Pepe signs. It was this nexus of absolute like cringe, you know, cringe left libertarian shit with like, you know, Pepe features. You also saw basically an area where, Soros had used China in order to achieve several things, with this open society and just rise to power. But at the same time, you saw China basically stymie attempts by the American establishment, and this included Trump. This was this was an area where I would say many Democrats, deep state, Soros, Trump, Bannon, were all in agreement. It's just that the Biden administration has a different approach about how to work with China or how to contain China. Not a lot of containing, as this week has already beginning to prove. But that is an area where that happened, and it was a betrayal of Soros as well. Soros might use the Chinese and has been working with them for decades, but Soros ain't happy that China is like the fastest growing economy and is also authoritarian. Um, he might praise China for some things, but until China has like daily disputes over the fate of trans children, and until Chinese Twitter or its equivalent is like the American, trust me, he's not happy. And I think this is this is China's like moment, Armenian moment, as it were, right, where they used all these guys and they for what they were worth, and at the right time they catapulted them. So it's just an interesting nexus for me. It's an area where like it's like Trump basically saying that the mission of the Pentagon is to legalize gay marriage all over the world. It's that like incredibly gay, uh, let's say, you know, neoliberal moment. I'm
Yeah,
sorry, the word escaped.
I would agree, and I do think still probably one of the most fascinating things about this most recent wave of Hong Kong protests is that they started out like the ones in 2014, where again these people had crosses and Union Jacks, and ended up with cam girls talking about Xi Jinping is mean because he doesn't like porn or whatever, and it just the like think what you will about the initial protests and their goals and their demands, but just how fast this changed, and honestly the brief right wing love affair with it just because it was anti Chinese. I do think honestly though it did wake up a lot of people on just being reflexively anti China for the sake of it. Like because there's still plenty of people
Yes,
out there who
yeah,
I know that will criticize China up and down all day, but still call the Hong Kong protests GHEY, so to speak. And
right.
frankly, for a while there, I was one of them when I had some different perspectives when I had a more optimistic take on American global power that hey maybe this can be redirected, but that warrants a topic a show of its own. But you did see a radical hijacking of it, and again at the end of the day, it was Soros, it was people like that, and to the point where really the issue was, as you said, China isn't enough of a wonderland of trans rights and sex work or whatever, and yeah, and that's their ultimate issue. They've milked all the money they can out of China. Now's the time to really make China decide, hey, do you want to be part of the West so we can milk more money out of you, or do you want to pursue your own ambitions and try to become a global power yourself? And frankly, given that choice to any country, that isn't a hard choice. Love or hate China, look, I would hope, I know I would, your country would do the same given that choice if it had the ability
Yeah.
to sort of establish its own system versus hey you can keep on with this incestuous economic relationship except you have to accept X, Y, and Z, which is antithetical to your culture. It's really a no-brainer. And you know what, I will say this, I've said it about Erdogan just as a complete aside, but just to sort of put this all the rest, that you don't have to like somebody to admire them, you don't have to like something to admire it. And
Hmm.
frankly, I feel this way about Erdogan in Turkey. I think Xi Jinping and what China is doing is objectively admirable from the sense that I wish I lived in a country with that sort of ambition and vision and had a leader who was that competent.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, in some ways, the leaders in the West are invisible, and so the experiment in Western governance in the 20th century, especially in the modern era, is to have rule, as you say, rule by a managerial class, right? Uh, the West, I think, was so phased by World War One and Two that there's other factors as well. The Industrial Revolution, the way that so fundamentally changed life, and how that had like although rapid, a much more accumulative and slower process than all the countries, say, in Eastern Europe and other parts of the world had to catch up, right? So, you know, we kind of intuit that the oligarchic class in the West are really the masters of this civilization. And the point is not to have a leader that's too charismatic, or maybe Obama is the last sort of charismatic leader that is also part of the managerial class that we have. With all the ridiculous contradictions, like he gave an interview the other day about how he inherited all these terrible wars, and what was he supposed to do? His hands were tied. Well, I mean, you
Tied
went
to that
from
drone
two to
strike
seven
button.
wars. Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just, but he'll be forgiven in the same way that Trump will be forgiven, because he's just so darn charismatic, right? That no matter how much your narrative is disproven, people's attachment to narrative has and it's no exaggeration, a religious tone, right? It's irrefutable to them. So, anyways, not to go off on a tangent, but yeah, yeah, the leadership isn't there, and in many ways, any great charismatic leadership in a country that's already so divided, so fractured, will disappoint some huge portion of it anyways. It just is, that is what it is.
Yeah, I can't really add anything more to that. So I suppose we will move on and close out the show with a little bit of Syria news because there has been some developments there. And now Russian forces, one of the big stories, have set up patrols along the Iraqi-Syrian border to counter the new rise of ISIS. You've had rise of ISIS near Hama. There's been shelling of rebel-held villages in Idlib. The Turks have been shelling, of course, Kurdish-held villages in northeastern Syria. There have been skirmishes near the Golan Heights, and of course there have been more Israeli strikes in the country. You've had the U.S. troops there backing SDF and Kurdish forces who are combating ISIS in northern Syria. So really business as usual, except I think probably the most significant news this week is the increase in Israeli strikes. And now the Israeli government is claiming, now who knows if this is the case or not, but what the Israeli government is claiming at least is that Russia and Iran are in a dispute over quote unquote influence in southern Syria. Now, I personally don't believe it. I don't think even
No,
if
it's
there are those conflicts there, that they're really in position to air those conflicts out, especially when there's Israeli bombs dropping on Iranian backed forces. But, who am I to question the great Israeli PR machine? Because,
I mean, it's kind of like, it is projection of what Israel wish it were true. In the same way, people who will tell you that Russia's going to become Chinese very soon, very soon. I've been listening to that for over 25 years. But even though proportionally Canada has like a Chinese population that is 6 times the size of Russia's. So I think it's just wishful thinking, right? It's kind of like oh, what's his name, Blinken, suggesting that Russia's a gas station with nuclear weapons. Uh, they want you to believe that there's the Russia. Putin wants Russians to believe that there's no difference, substantial difference between Russia and America, especially with elections. And it's like, well, I don't know. This one was pretty fraudulent. So, like, it's looking dumb. These are all they're all just really bad. Like, I know for normies this really works, but for anybody else, like, it's not really paying off. It's not even good propaganda.
No, not at all. And it is going back to Syria. Interesting watching what we said was going to happen sort of play out, where things are, aside from a resurgence in ISIS attacks and the reaction to those, and Israeli strikes here and there, actions by the Syrian government have really calmed down, as if they're anticipating a more hawkish administration coming into power now. It seems like, I mean, they've made fantastic progress. Just go back and compare the previous maps to what Idlib is right now, to the point where it's completely like just that little encirclement. I'm pretty sure, just by the slightest stretch, they're cut off from those pro-Turkish forces in northern Syria near Afrin. So that says something in and of itself. Not that the
Mhm.
forces in Idlib are on the best terms with Turkey currently, because there have been disputes with that, and there has been that playing out with them, in fact, skirmishing with Turkish forces, and a lot of those forces moving into Libya and Nagorno Karabakh, and just the various other places that they get sent, or hell, going back home to whatever country, or going to Europe as migrants and refugees. All the various places they may go. Of course, that pocket near the Jordanian and Iraqi border has not been touched in 5 years, and that makes sense. Pretty sure that if not officially, at least unofficially, there is a significant American presence operating there. So that's probably going to be there to stay for a while, especially under a Biden administration. But I just think Israel's claims about this are interesting, with all things considered, with Netanyahu sort of on the rocks, and just with the narrative Israel's trying to paint as the entire world shifts, and just how much. You think we've sunk a lot into Syria. Just imagine how much Israel has sunk into Syria trying to remove Assad, and I mean, they're neighbors in the control of the Golan
Yeah.
Heights and the recognition of the annexation, which again, I can tell you for a fact, Biden's not going to revoke the recognition of the annexation. I don't think anyone here needs to hear that, but once those things are done, he's also not moving the capital out of Jerusalem. He's not moving it back to Tel Aviv or whatever. Once those things are done, they stay done, especially in this sort of situation. But
Oh yeah. Um, and if I remember correctly, I think it was either Putin or Lavrov who said that Israel remains the greatest stumbling block to peace in Syria. Like, so this might be just a tit for tat, right? I mean, ultimately, the statement from Russia is more true than the statement from Israel.
why would Netanyahu ever lie? Okay, let's just get that out of the way. But yeah, my main prediction for Syria going forward, as we do move into an era of Biden, is that that big yellow blob right there of Kurdish and quote unquote SDF forces, that's going to get bolstered. Now, I don't think they're going to clash directly with the Syrian government, but that is where American support and American money and American focus is going to be, in that big yellow blob, because that keeps Turkey on its toes, that keeps Syria on its toes. Of course, that big green blob in the south, they're going to have still quite an investment in, but again, the resources are going forward is Biden is probably going to run a very pro Kurdish administration when it comes at least to the conflict in Syria, because removing Assad is pretty untenable right now. Even if they wanted to, they aren't really in the position to do it. Even more strikes on Syria, that's still iffy unless you're Israel. But more American strikes in Syria. Look, we may see some of what we saw under Trump with the strikes at airfields and really just low intensity strikes that didn't really change the balance of power at all. But in terms of American involvement in Syria, oh, it's going to get much deeper. But like I said, I still predict it's going to be among the Kurds, and that's all I really have to say for Syria, at least this week.
Well, I mean, I think it's extremely significant that Russia now is patrolling that area just sort of northeast of the area that America has sort of taken over on the border with Iraq. Like this is a first, and it's actually a really positive development.
Yeah, I would say so, and I would say Russia entrenching itself in Syria under the last weeks of the Trump administration is probably a very wise move. Of course, they've had their
Hmm.
positions in Latakia and near Tartus where their assets are, but moving in, like even also towards Iraq and having their influence there with the volatile state of Iraq is also a wise move. And just for these last couple minutes here, because we are pushing an hour 40, but just for these last couple minutes here, going forward, since we are more or less approaching the end of the Trump administration, what will you miss most about Trump?
Oh, wow. I suppose it's not Trump directly, but Trump derangement. I should have been bored by this, but in the way that their delicious screeching, their end of the world hysteria that America would disappear with with Trump in office. It was just outrageous. In the odd time that he would say something so flagrant and ridiculous, or he'd say a half truth, and you already knew after 3 years that he's doing it because he knows it will drive them crazy. And later, like, it just became a game. I understand that um, it got tiresome, and it got really tiresome for some people. But for me, like, maybe it wasn't all that tiresome. Sometimes I just tuned it out. But now that he's going, I think we're going to look back, and at least I will look back and really laugh at this, um, at least for a little while.
I think what I'm going to miss most is stuff like the Merkel Starburst story and
Oh yeah, that is just wow.
just his general beratement of the media at press conferences, just him yelling at journalists. I think I not that I imagine we'll get that under Biden, but there's just something special about when I think it was Jim Acosta that Trump had the long going rivalry with. I know there were several of them, but Jim Acosta, the CNN guy, sticks out to me in particular. Just the long running feud he
Yes.
would have, just constantly berating him at press conferences and just yelling at him and telling him not to speak. Again, I think I'm gonna miss the press conferences. Not that the Biden ones won't be good, but the Trump ones are just special in the like just how intentionally adversarial is because I think Biden's going to be very unintentionally adversarial in the press conferences when they even do have them. But it's going to be sad to see it go, but there is also the case, and I believe our friend Vile Varangian has made this case, and we'll try to get him back on probably in February or so. I think that would probably be about the time frame we get him on, but it may ultimately be good. It may be ultimately a silver lining for the right wing all across the Western world to have less of an attachment to a personality, somebody such as Trump, and may allow us to move on and think of bigger and better things, so to speak. And there's a case to be made for that. And I really, despite how fun the Trump presidency has been, I really hope he does not run 2024 because again, I do think we've had our fun, but I do think we need to look at bigger and better things. Not that I think there's many options out there in terms of that, but at that rate, I might just take Trump as a hey, it's better than nothing. But I really hope I really hope a proper successor to at least the rhetoric Trump campaign on 2016 comes about in the next 4 years. And like I said, it'll be interesting going forward. I'm sure so long as he is still allowed on social media after he loses the protections of the presidency, he'll still be a riot there. I'm sure he'll still be very vocal even in the traditional media. And oh, look, make no mistake, if he leaves office, it's definitely not the last you're going to see of him. And pretty much probably until the day he croaks, he's going to be haranguing on these issues. He's probably going to be one of the most vocal former presidents we've ever had, for better and for worse. But above all, it'll at least be very entertaining.
Yeah, well said.
But with that being said, that concludes yet another episode of the War Report, and we are drawing ever closer to Christmas. So if we don't get an episode out next week before then, have a Merry Christmas. I hope it's a good time, and we'll see you all. We're approaching the end of the year. But we'll be planning a end of the year review, which this one's gonna be. This is probably gonna be like 3 hours. I exaggerate, but I'll try to keep it. I'll try to keep it around or under 2 hours going forward. But yeah, a 2020 review episode will be coming out in the next few weeks as we look back on this year and sort of document it as we've done with 2018, 2019. But yeah, we got a lot to work with this year, and forgive us if we leave anything out because we're gonna have to make some cuts somewhere, or else we're never gonna get a full episode of that out. It's gonna be 10 hours if we try to cover everything. But thank you everyone for tuning in, and goodbye.
Thank you and take care, guys.